What's going on, guys? Today we're going to be talking about butt wink, which for whatever reason in the world of fitness is a weird controversial topic. Everybody wants to be right about butt wink and say that it's dangerous or it's not dangerous. Like, I don't really care who is actually right. What I care about is contextualizing this topic for the vast majority of lifters out there who are all very individual and approaching this topic from a performance output standpoint. I think we get so hung up on is it dangerous versus is it not, that we kind of get blinded by our own bias to actually talk about and have a discussion if butt wink is actually productive for our goals and squat patterns. And that's what this video is going to be about. It's going to be about my take on conceptualizing this topic and how I think lifters can be a bit more productive in nature if they think about it from a performance output standpoint versus just an injury standpoint. But let's talk about what butt wink is before we actually dive into all of that detail. So when lifting, butt wink will present itself as a tucked pelvis in a full range of motion squat. So when you are squatting, whether it be a unilateral squat or bilateral squat, that pelvis will tuck under the tailbone at your full range of motion. So generally once you exceed well past 90 degrees, we'll start to see that pelvis round under, and then when we stand back up, that pelvis will return into its neutral-esque position. All right, so now that we've briefly discussed what butt wink is, let's talk about what can cause it and also if it's dangerous. So what can cause butt wink? So there are a couple different theories out there. Some theories suggest that it's tight hamstring related. Some theories suggest that it is your femoral head neck anatomy along with your hip socket depth and shallowness. And then some theories say that people just don't know how to squat properly. And I think all of these obviously require context based on who you are working with or how you are squatting. So we're not going to dive into what it always is, because again, there are so many layers here that I would highly guess that no two cases of butt wink are exactly the same. So what's actually causing butt wink, I don't think really freaking matters, because our individuality needs to be accounted for. And there's never gonna be butt wink is happening all the time because of this kind of logic / mentality. And so now when it comes to is butt wink dangerous, you will have an ungodly amount of back and forth with folks who look at the research and say, well, there's no suggestion that butt wink could lead to injury, versus like those who have physical anecdotes who say, I injured myself squatting a lot or doing a thruster with a lot of weight and going into a butt winked position. And again, I don't think that this back and forth conversation here is productive, because when we look at how every lifter moves and how every lifter has their own anatomical differences, when we're talking about goals for what they're trying to achieve, I think it's way more productive to approach butt wink from a performance output standpoint in relation to one's goals. So how does butt wink physically relate to one's sport? How does it relate to their hypertrophy goals? How does it relate to their overall movement patterning? That is a much more, I think, productive conversation to have, and kind of why I wanted to make this video. So now let's talk about that and how I like to conceptualize butt wink in a variety of lifters. All right, so now we're gonna get into the meat and potatoes of this talk, and I promise it's gonna be a little bit long, but hang with me here. So why I do not like butt wink when it's presented in a variety of lifters, especially when trained over time and making that a staple in one's movement patterns, is because when we are talking about performance output, when we are in this range of motion where the pelvis is tucked, I would ask and beg the question, how are we physically leveraging the prime movers in the squat to increase our performance output? So prime movers in the squat, quads, glutes, adductors, these are all gonna be firing at different points in the squat. Generally, when we start to pass 90 degrees, that's when we're gonna have a bit more adductor turned on. We're gonna have a little bit of internal rotation naturally happen at the knees. And if we're tucking the pelvis, what are we gonna be doing when it comes to actively engaging the quads to, number one, maintain our flexed knee position before it goes into extension through the concentric? I would ask, how are the glutes actually going to be engaged if they are rounded and tucked under the pelvis? And also I would ask, how are the adductors actually going to do their job in assisting with hip extension out of the hole and adducting the legs if the pelvis is fully tucked and they're in a position where they're a little bit more at a disadvantage? So this is why I think training with a butt wink and saying that you can train with butt wink and it's perfectly fine over long periods of time is kind of counterproductive, because here we go diving into the individuality of one's goals and how butt wink can impact that. if I'm working with a power lifter, we need a very specific amount of depth to clear in competition. When we are training, we can do a little bit of a deeper positioning for squats to ensure we're getting full range of motion, but generally we're gonna be hovering around the amount that we need for comp. So if a lifter is presenting with butt wink and going into this full excessive range of motion, how are they going to be physically able to load 1RMs and work with maximal attempts when they're in a position where a lot of the prime movers in the squat are actually not in an advantage to help them out when in a more dead stop position at the bottom, which they need to clear for competition purposes. All right, so now let's talk about butt wink from a bodybuilding / muscular hypertrophy point of view. And this is where I think people can get confused with muscular hypertrophy because bigger range of motion, bigger gains, like I get the logic. However, let's talk about butt wink and then relate that again to the prime movers and the squat. And first off, like I don't really think the back squat is that productive for hypertrophy in the first place, but we can dive into that in a different video. So if we're trying to, for example, cause hypertrophy of the quad and glute in the back squat, and at the end range of motion, we're actually tucking the pelvis and putting the glute and quad into a disadvantaged position where they're not actually going to be able to fire and assist with our maximal capabilities, then I would ask, is that range of motion productive? Plus, to take it a step further, if we're using range of motion to gauge progression in our exercise, we need to quantify that and create more of like a qualitative range that we're working with. So if we're going into a butt winked position and we're actually disadvantaging a lot of the muscles that we're trying to train and create muscular hypertrophy for, I would ask, is that range of motion equal to other leg movements you are doing? And also, how is that going to translate to the muscles you are trying to target? So instead of necessarily forcing a back squat, using things like a hack squat or other squat patterns where you can get a full range of motion for the quad, glute, adductors, etc., I think is a much more productive means of approaching this topic. And you're gonna create a better quantified means of using your range of motion into the fullest extent for progressions. Because when we're squatting and if we're presenting with butt wink, there will be a threshold where we're gonna be capped by our abilities because with that butt wink presenting itself, I would argue that most lifters, when they get to certain intensities, are gonna fatigue way faster due to having to work harder out of that bottom range of motion, that they're not gonna actually be able to take their quad or glutes to mechanical failure or a high level of mechanical tension that would even cause a great degree of muscular hypertrophy versus if we just focused on a more isolated approach or a better variation of an exercise that would allow us to better gauge the mechanical tension we're creating with the range of motion we're working with. Now, when we look at it from a functional fitness standpoint, I would once again argue that if you're doing something like a thruster or a timed workout where you are squatting every minute on the minute and you're presenting with, once again, butt wink, that's just gonna be extra energy required from you to move. Plus, when you're getting tired and when you are a little bit off balance, etc., if we're presenting with butt wink and we're pulling that bar away from our midfoot position, if we're taking the pelvis and disengaging it from the torso at the very bottom, I would ask, is that going to be productive for your workout goals at hand? And then looking at it from a recreational lifter standpoint who is just concerned about general strength, once again, I just do not see a context where having excessive pelvis rounding is going to be conducive for their goals. Why would you once again want to put yourself into a compromised position at the bottom end range of a squat just for the sake of doing it? There will always come a threshold where I think lifters will get enough discomfort or lose balance enough to where they're going to want to limit that range to functionally work with the positioning that they need to achieve the sets and intensities at hand. Then looking at it from a beginner standpoint, yes, a lot of lifters are not going to be able to necessarily instantly injure themselves with butt wink because they're not lifting enough loads. But at the same time, why are we having beginners and telling them that it's totally fine to present with butt wink when they are in the best time to learn proper squat patterns and be more individual with how they're positioning themselves to achieve their squats? And now I know that was a lot to take in and I rambled for quite some time, but now I want to talk about that if you do have butt wink in your squat patterns, what you can do about it and how to navigate this to be a bit more productive for your performance output based on your goals. So when navigating butt wink, I'm going to go ahead and focus on a couple of different areas and how to navigate around butt wink to make sure you're getting the most out of your performance. So let's say you are somebody who wants to improve their squat performance and you are presenting with butt wink. What are a few things you can do? So the first thing I would suggest is exploring heel elevations and how that can relate to your depth in regard to your pelvis position and your torso position. A lot of times, if we elevate the heels, for example, for taller lifters, we're gonna allow our knees to track more forward and maintain a more upright torso position, and also hit greater ranges of depth without having that pelvis fully tuck under the body. The second thing I would say to explore is to actually physically look at your squat and when the pelvis starts to tuck. As soon as that pelvis starts to tuck, I would say limit your range of motion to that. Nobody is gonna give you a magic award for hitting some arbitrary in range of motion in the squat because social media says you have to go ass to grass. Like, no, if you're getting adequate range, so if you're hitting 90 degrees or a little bit lower and you are not compromising your positioning and you're able to perform at a high level, go with that range. Nobody's gonna give you an award for hitting your ass to the floor. The third thing I would say to do is once you've explored heel elevations, once you've explored looking at a functional range that is comfortable for your body and actually conducive to your anatomy, look at adding tempos and pauses to your squats to then ingrain this range of motion that you're trying to achieve into your future squats. So adding a mesocycle where you work with tempos, where you work with pauses can be really useful for somebody who is trying to navigate away from going into excessive butt wink in the squat when they're worried about their performance output. Now, when looking at butt wink from more of a muscular hypertrophy lens, I have one suggestion, and that is if you're trying to get full range of motion in the squat to target the glutes and quads, adductors, and all the other supporting musculature, explore different exercise variations that allow you to achieve greater ranges without putting your pelvis into a tucked position. This would be looking at things like hack squat, unilateral squat variations, things that are going to allow you to hit ranges of motion in non-compromised positions and then allow you to quantify that range of motion and use it as a progression to scale muscular hypertrophy from a mechanical tension driven standpoint. Overall, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. I know it was a long one, I know it was kind of ranty, but it was a topic that I wanted to discuss and also open up a conversation to go back and forth with my community. But as always guys, drop a like on the video, drop subscribe to the channel, see you guys in the next one.